right, good evening, everybody. Um, my name is Paul Swine, and welcome to this edition of the Boston.com book club. We are here tonight to talk about It's Better to Be Feared by Seth Wickersham, the instant New York Times bestseller about the New England Patriots dynasty and the pursuit of greatness. Seth is an Alaska native who has been covering the Patriots for ESPN for over 20 years now. He got to ESPN just as Bill Belichick and Tom Brady got to New England, and he's been covering the Patriots and the NFL doggedly ever since. We had a chance, Seth and myself had a chance to talk with people at the Bull Run a couple weeks ago, just to celebrate his release, and so we're excited to talk again with you all tonight. I hope everybody is safe and has power after the storm, and glad that you all can join us tonight. So at this point, I'd like to bring on Seth, and we'll get our conversation started.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Paul. Paul, what jersey you got there?
This is my Troy Brown jersey. Troy Brown is my all-time favorite player.
Very cool.
Yeah, it's actually the only Patriots jersey I own because I never need another one. So to start us off, when we do events at the store, our events manager Kira likes to always ask people what's in the background. You've got some cool things in the background behind you. What do you got there?
You know, and I just had a picture that was right underneath that one that just fell 5 minutes ago. So I don't have quite as much on as I used to, but you know, I've got some guitars. I play periodically. The black one was on the cover of Rolling Stone with Bruce Springsteen. It's a 1932 Gibson, and so that's obviously one of my favorites. You know, I should have like the entire library and that entire setup. You know, after a year and a half of doing all this stuff out of your house, I should have it by now, but I still don't have it up.
Hey, you know, interesting backgrounds are interesting backgrounds. They don't have to be books. What are those two helmets on the desk there?
So I grew up in before I grew up in Alaska. I was born and raised during the first part of my life in Boulder, Colorado. I was a Broncos fan. And one of the Broncos helmets in the back is actually just a little toy helmet that I had when I was a kid. You know, it fit my little, 4-year-old head. And the other one is a retro Broncos helmet, like the Patriots have one too from the 60s. And right. So, even though I don't, root for the Broncos, anymore, I always just kind of like the helmet. So that's why I've got it.
Yeah, it's a solid helmet for sure. Better than the one they have now, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So getting into the book, I wanted to ask you, one of the biggest things that I really enjoyed in the book was that you did a good job of not getting bogged down in the sort of extraneous stories or extraneous like side stories or statistics that so often weigh these kinds of things down. So I just wanted to ask, how was that process go? Like, did you have a first draft that was much longer than the finished product? And if so, how long?
No, the book wasn't much longer. I think I trimmed a little bit here or there, but it was pretty much the same. I think that, you're right about the Patriots and this dynastic run. It spans so long, and there are so many rabbit holes you can go down, and there are so many moments that could be their own book, really, when you think about it. And Tom Brady's had an book written on him, and so has Bill Belichick, and Aaron Hernandez has been a book, and people have written about Deflategate, and there's just all these things you can do. And I think that, like, when I was doing it, I don't know if it was like that conscious or not, but I tried to write to the moments and the events that I just found interesting as someone who, had watched Tom Brady, acclimate to fame to a certain extent in person, and, what that was like for him. The San Diego Chargers game in 2001, that was really kind of Brady's coming out party. I begin with a with a long sort of dissertation about how that game came to be. Obviously, Troy Brown had a big punt return in that game. That was something that interested me, especially because Mike Riley, the Chargers head coach, was really the guy going back to high school that saw the genius in Tom Brady and knew what Tom Brady was capable of, even more than Bill Belichick did that day. And then I just looked for moments. One of the things I've always been fascinated about with Coach Belichick is how he gets into the heads of opposing quarterbacks and opposing head coaches. And I really wanted to write to those moments. I mean, obviously Mike Martz in the Super Bowl, Peyton Manning during the early part of the dynasty, Mike Shanahan on that famous Monday night game in 2003 where Belichick took the intentional safety and they end up winning the game. So
I was at that game.
It was in Denver. You were there.
Yeah. I was at that. Yeah, it was like 3 months into grad school. I was at that game.
Yeah. So I think I just looked for those moments that I found interesting and maybe were a little bit overlooked and just tried to report and add, whatever I could to them.
Awesome. One of the sections in the book, the middle section, is called The Highest Plateau. Was there anyone, did you get any pushback about calling this one dynasty? Like, should it be called two dynasties? Or, how do you define, I guess, dynasty in a larger sense, Yeah,
it's a great question. I mean, I don't know. I guess that, I always say the early part of the dynasty or the later part, but, clearly there are ones that are, there's people who just, consider the dynasty two separate dynasties maybe. But the middle part of the book, I'm glad you mentioned that because it was one of my most fun parts to kind of explore. You had Tom Brady and Bill Belichick who had, they were in this cultural and professional thin air, the thinnest air maybe, and yet they were coming up just short. And, they really did something that I think is pretty brave. And they went back and they reevaluated their belief systems. And, those belief systems had maybe worked better than any in NFL history. But, that's kind of where you saw Tom Brady invent his own method in the TB12 method. And he was trying to find ways. Remember that famous misfire Welker in the Super Bowl against the Giants that could have iced that game? He's trying to find ways to make himself 2 inches more accurate in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl. And then you have Bill Belichick, who I think realized, especially in that 2014 season, that he might find, and after almost 10 years of coming up short, they might need something in a game to get them going. Like they might end up, and they needed some sort of way to jumpstart them. And that's really where they came up with the Baltimore and the Raven formations that obviously ended up, working so well in the Ravens playoff game. And really, I think that was a big moment that kind of reignited their dynasty.
For sure. One of the other things I really enjoyed about the book is that while the three main three main people covered are Bill Belichick, Tom Brady, and Robert Kraft. We get you did a very good job of fleshing out other characters, be it Roger Goodell or Eric Mangini, and one of the ones that you did a pretty good job of was Jerry Jones, and the point you made in the book was kind of a chip on Kraft's shoulder that I've won 6 Super Bowls and this guy hasn't won anything since 1995, and why is he in the Hall of Fame and I'm not? And I just, that all stirred up again for me today, seeing your report on the owners and how Jones is going to bat for Stan Kroenke, who is not really beloved in any of the cities where he conducts business. And personally, I remember when I was doing grad school in Denver, people told me in no uncertain terms, do not intern for Kroenke because you don't get paid and they will work you to the bone. So I was curious,
Belichick.
Yeah, well, at least he paid them a little bit. But I was curious for your thoughts on a couple of things here. A, about Jerry Jones specifically, B, about having to do your regular job while you're doing this book, which had to be like living two different lives, and just kind of the confluence of all that?
Well, I think that Jerry, yeah, I did try to write about the dynasty both from the inside and the outside because they were so powerful. The Patriots were so successful that everybody else's accomplishments were really had to be viewed within the context of the Patriots' greatness, right? I mean, every time I went Peyton Manning, I was really kind of writing about the Patriots because they were the standard that he had to try to overcome. And with Jerry Jones, he's an interesting figure because Kraft has asked voters, what's the appeal of Jerry Jones? It seems like he's asking as a way to get at, like, what's this guy done that I haven't? And, what do I got to do to get into the Hall of Fame? And I think that Kraft will be in the Hall of Fame for two reasons. And they have nothing to do with his work on the collective bargaining agreements or the broadcast deals, which are big. But, he probably orchestrated the greatest trade in NFL history when he traded for Bill Belichick. And he managed to find a way to keep this band together as long as he did. I mean, he learned from what, disintegrated the Cowboys in the 90s. And so I think he'll get in. But like one thing we've learned is that Hall of Fame owners or Hall of Fame voters just have no whatsoever for billionaires who think that they deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. They take their time with this stuff. And I think that even some of the politicking that's been done on Kraft's behalf, I think is kind of backfired in a lot of ways too. In terms of my job, yeah, I mean, today I wrote a story about Jerry Jones and Robert Kraft was in there and Stan Kroenke from the owners. And, honestly, I just enjoy that stuff. And I think that as a writer, I think one of the best things you can do is switch gears. It keeps your mind kind of fresh. And if I would get stuck writing the book, I could turn to my investigative work at ESPN. Like Don Van Natten and I did a very in-depth story on DeMaurice Smith, the union head for the NFLPA. And that was a really good kind of break to like get away from the book, think about someone else in a different context. And so, I just kind of did it and hopefully they all worked out in the end.
Absolutely. No, I've often seen novelists post that the best way to write their novel is to write another novel. So I guess that's sort of the same principle.
Yeah.
You talk about the trade for Bill Belichick, and there's so many off the field what ifs that run all through this dynasty, most notably with Aaron Hernandez and so many others. But what about kind of the on-field what ifs? One of the ones that you mentioned in the first Giants Super Bowl is how Brady thought they should have scored on the very first play of the game, which was going to be a screen pass to Lawrence Maroney. He threw it off his shoes instead of getting it to him. But when you go back and look at the 20 years, are there any other on-field what ifs besides that one that kind of stand out to you?
Well, I would say this, and it references what I had said before, but what if Belichick had not gotten home in the middle of the 2014 season, turned on LSU Alabama, and watched his friend Nick and the offensive coordinator Lane Kiffin run a play called Fight Song? And it was a play that, displaced receivers. Belichick, made a note of it. And, he tells Josh McDaniels and the offensive staff, hey, we got to figure out our version of this. And you think about, like, what if they didn't have those plays? Because they were playing the Ravens in the playoffs. And the Ravens were one of those teams that just were, they were just not scared of New England. And they were not scared of playing in Foxborough. And they come in and, they're up 14 points midway through the third quarter. And Belichick says, this is it. Let's go with Baltimore and Raven. And it really kind of reignited them. Even though the Ravens came back to take the lead, Brady came back and won that game. But if they had lost that game, what happens to that dynasty? I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo has just finished his rookie year. Belichick's deeply invested in him. You've got Tom Brady, who at that point would have been 10 years removed from his last Super Bowl and, had not finished well in a lot of big games. you just wonder, like, that to me is like a big what if. Like, what if they had not had those plays and they had lost that Ravens game? Who knows what happens?
Speaking of Brady, after there's a short chapter in the book about the Mannings, about Peyton Manning and him growing up, and then the '03 or the championship game after the '03 season that the Patriots won 24-14. And at the end of that chapter, you talk a little bit about how former President Bush's press office had asked the NFL to send a player, and they said, "Well, we've got two names for you, but let's see what happens in the AFC Championship, and then we'll tell you."
Mm-hmm.
And the Patriots go on to win 24-14, kind of beating the snot out of Colts receivers and kind of forever changing holding rules. But then after that, they sent Brady to the State of the Union, and no one really made a big deal out of it until he showed up on camera, and then everyone's like, "Why is Tom Brady in the State of the Union address?" Which was a really cool thing to see, and definitely not something I remembered about 2003 or 2004. Do you think that is the moment where the Brady versus Manning debate irrevocably shifted towards Brady's side, or do you think there's another point, or do you think it never shifted and it should still be a debate?
Man, I mean, that's interesting. I never thought about it within the context of the debate. I mean, it's got to be weird to be Peyton Manning. He was just this legendary player. And yet Tom Brady has had a Hall of Fame career in the years since Manning retired. Just in the years that Manning has retired, if you just take those years, what is it, 5 years, Brady's had a complete Hall of Fame career just in those 5 years, most of which, he was in his 40s. But I think what made that moment interesting to me, at least, was it was another example of Brady's skyrocketing fame. And, what was it like for him to deal with that? It was hard. And, he told his parents at one point, after the first Super Bowl win against the Rams, he was like, "Look, my life is going to change and your life is going to change." And it did change. I mean, the Boston Herald, the Inside Track, I think they mentioned him 61 times in between when he took over starting for the Patriots quarterback and the start.
Looks like we lost Seth there for a second.
Out
While
of it.
we're
What
there
happened?
you are. I don't know. You froze for a second.
Oh, well, I was going to say, it's like one of the things about Brady that I think is really interesting is that he always finds ways to kind of bounce out of, whatever mindset, he might be in when he gets to a dark place. And in the middle of the 2003 season, he, just was whining about how fame had affected his life and all the things he couldn't do. And he was talking to Greg Harden, his old counselor at Michigan. And as he's whining, Greg Harden starts laughing at him. And it's a little bit of a theme where Harden would laugh at Brady when Brady would whine. And he said, "Tom, let me get this straight. You want to be the best in the world at what you do, but you don't want to like have all this stuff that comes along with it." He goes, "Look, right now you can pick up a phone and change a kid's life in 5 minutes. Do that because you're the hot cookie now and you're not going to be the hot cookie forever." As it turns out, Brady's the hottest cookie that ever lived.
Absolutely. We're going to talk for a few more minutes, but I just wanted to encourage everyone, if you have questions, to drop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them. We have some pre-submitted questions as well that I'm going to be asking Seth here in a couple minutes. The other thing what was the reaction last week when you landed on the bestseller list? Do you have any cool stories that came out of that?
I don't know. That was just a cool moment. I mean, that's, you write a book for people to consume it in a way that's a little bit different when you write an investigative piece or a magazine story. And so, like, being on the bestseller list in the first week was just, it was really, really cool and special.
Absolutely. It doesn't happen to a lot of people. It's a list that's hard to crack because once you get on it, can be kind of self-sustaining in a way. So that was really cool to see, especially because it's not a sports nonfiction, it's just nonfiction.
Yeah, they changed the categories a couple of years ago. Yeah.
So it's a lot harder for a sports book to crack that list, I think. It's really not that often that we see sports books on there.
It was interesting because the Beatles came out with a book last week too. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, you got to be joking. Like, I figured maybe, I might get some competition from the Trump books or whatever, but the Beatles, are you joking? Like,
not just a Beatles book about a movie that Peter Jackson, the famed Lord of the Rings director, made about the Beatles.
Yeah.
And in a month from now, when that movie comes out, everyone's going to come streaming in here looking for the book. Yeah, so that kind of a big deal. So yeah, that's pretty awesome that you could stand up with that kind of competition. We have about a dozen or so pre-submitted questions. So Rajiv asks, when your ESPN story broke at the start of the playoffs regarding the rift between Brady and Belichick, this was a couple of years ago.
Yep.
Did you face a lot of scrutiny from fans who wanted you to wait until after the playoffs to release the story?
Oh, that's a good question. The timing of it. I mean, I got, that was a controversial piece. There's been a lot of reporting, mine, the Boston Globe, Tom Curran, to name a couple, that year about, problems in the building. And I thought I was, kind of adding to the discussion when I wrote that piece. And, it defined me in a way that was surprising. And so I think that like I limited the amount of feedback from social media that I could receive because it was so overwhelming. I wouldn't be able to like read it all anyway. In terms of the timing of it, yeah, it came out the Friday of the bye week, if I remember correctly. And so, yeah, so then they had a game the next week. But, one of the things with the Patriots is that like they know how to take everyone's best shot and to survive it. I mean, it was one of the real like things that made Belichick and Brady so special. We talk about their personality differences so often, but really these guys are amazing at focusing on what's ahead. And not only that, but being optimistic about it. It's a very rare trait, and they come at different angles. From, Brady's more earnest. Belichick is a little bit more dour, and he kind of has to figure out all the ways the team can lose before figuring out how they can win. But you just watch how this played out on global stages where Brady's having these fourth quarter double-digit deficits twice in Super Bowls, or he rallies them to wins. And all of the great goal line stands over the years by Belichick's defenses, going back to when he was the defensive coordinator from the Giants, and they stuffed the Broncos at the goal line. There's just nobody who's ever been able to flush what happened and focus on the tasks in front of them like these two guys. And I don't know if my story is an example of that from them, but they're just really good at, taking the best shot from the league, from the press, from various players and coaching, and, finding ways to persevere within that.
And I mean, the franchise has had a lot of practice with that over the years in big moments, right? The Will McDonough story that broke before the Packers Super Bowl in the 90s, the John Tomase story that broke, in 07 right before the Super Bowl. Like it seems that these kinds of things kind of tend to find them, right? So maybe it's not as big of a deal for them as it used to be.
Yeah, I mean, Deflategate right before the Super Bowl.
Right, Deflategate too, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is crazy, the amount of things that have been kind of thrown their way, and how most of the time they're able to clear their heads and just focus on the game. And remember, Tom Brady was obviously very upset leading up to that Seahawks Super Bowl at Deflategate, it changed his life very instantly. And, he at his locker at the game, he had notes from his kids, and he had little reminders. And, he texted Rodney Harrison, I'm ready to play the biggest game of my life. And, just nobody's ever been able to focus like these two guys, I think.
For So another question we had that was submitted early from Natalie says, I'm curious for thoughts about the dynasty since Brady left the Patriots for Tampa. Does that mean it's officially over? Or is it possible the dynasty's success was largely attributed to Tom and will continue with him or will continue after?
I mean, it's hard to look at the dynasty the same way, but I mean, we'll just see. I mean, I think that for the longest time, of course, there was the Patriot way. And even though that's a phrase that nobody in the building ever used, that was kind of what they were known for. The Patriots had embodied this kind of persona, emotionless pursuit of victory, smart football. And then, towards the end, it was just obvious watching Brady and how seamlessly he transferred to Tampa, ends up winning a Super Bowl after Belichick and Kraft jointly decided that they didn't want to guarantee him a contract until age 45, that, there really wasn't a Patriot way. There was two very special human beings who came into each other's life at the perfect moment. Like both of them in 2000 understood how fleeting their careers were in football.
I think that's what the question, I think that's kind of what, I didn't read it exactly right, but I think that's what she was asking is if Brady keeps having success in Tampa, should we view it more as the Tom Brady dynasty rather than the New England Patriots dynasty?
Well, it's clear that Brady kind of almost has his own dynasty, but we'll see. I mean, whenever Belichick, walks away, he's always said privately that he wants to hand over a good team to his successor. You had guys like Bill Walsh at the 49ers who kind of hoped the team would fall apart when he left, and Bill's not that
remember good. He said that,
yeah, and I think that the quarterback position is a key part of that, and so whenever he walks away, and nobody knows that, having Mac Jones and having them set up at quarterback, I think is important. And he's always said, I'm not going to be Marv Levy coaching until I'm 70, but hey, he's coaching in my 70s, but hey, they've moved the goalpost before, so we'll see.
Right. Brady keeps moving the goalpost. Why can't
totally?
Belichick, right? Yeah. But that's an interesting concept. The kind of the notion that now that they have another good quarterback, that might make it easier for him to leave rather than more enticing for him to stay.
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to think about it, because I think you can, granted, 2 of the wins came against the Jets, but in these first 7 weeks, you can see the seeds of, maybe greatness is a little too strong, but you can see the seeds of like a really solid NFL quarterback in Mac Jones.
Oh yeah, I mean, he led a potentially game-winning drive against the defending Super Bowl champions in the rain. In that game. I mean, he's definitely shown flashes of being a special player. I mean, no one's going to expect him to be Tom Brady, but he definitely looks like he has a lot of special traits.
Well, and I mean, to me, even more impressive than the Tampa Bay drive. I mean, I know they lost the game, but after that pick 6 against Dallas, he comes right back and throws that 80-yard touchdown pass. And 80 yards is a bit of a misnomer, but it was like a 40-yard pass to Kendrick Bourne, who caught it in stride and was gone. And, it's something that happens so rare in any NFL game, but it was something that hadn't happened at all for the Patriots in the first, 5 3/4 games of the season. So to come back after, it looked like you were done and to make that throw, that was, to me, was a really important indicator.
Yeah, so, I've always wondered, I should have looked this up for the book or found someone to do it for me, but I've always wondered, what percentage of drives that Tom Brady leads his team to a score on after a turnover, especially if it's one of his turnovers. Because I mean, his ability to flush those plays, I mean, he does it all the time. And even the Tuck game, where he basically committed a turnover and got bailed out, they end up scoring on that drive. The Super Bowl when they played the Panthers, he throws a fourth quarter interception in the red zone and then leads them right down the field to score. Against Seattle in the Super Bowl, he throws an interception in the end zone on one of the first possessions and then comes back and leads them down the field. It's really a fascinating trait. And like I said, it's a really rare ability. Everyone talks about, the ability to forget and this healthy amnesia. And Brady is one of those guys that clearly has it in abundance, and maybe Mac Jones does too.
Yeah, it'd be real interesting to see. I mean, in basketball, there's a more direct correlation, and we talk about points after turnovers all the time in basketball. in football, we seem more to just about giveaways and takeaways generally, and less about how many points you scored after them, because there's so few scoring possessions in a football game. But yeah, I'm with you. I'd be willing to bet his percentage is pretty good. Another question that we had pre-submitted, and then we'll get to some of the live questions. Just really quickly, Jason asks, how many people in total were interviewed for the book?
I mean, it's a hard question. So I interviewed more than 100 specifically for the book, but because, I drew on a lot of work that I had done over my career that, never made it into an ESPN magazine story, or, even things you look back on now differently. I remember my very first meeting with Tom Brady in November of 2001. And, nobody even knew if he'd finished the season as a starter. And he says to me, football's always come really easy to me. And at the time, I'm like, who says something like that? This is ridiculous. You look back on that now and you're like, okay, that was a really interesting comment in retrospect. He clearly saw something in himself that nobody else saw, and believed it to his core. And so, I mean, several hundred people were interviewed for the book, but specifically for it, it was over 100 in the course of writing it.
And this kind of leads into our next question. So one of the questions submitted live from Jeff. He asks, how do you build relationships with players and coaches, especially in the beginning of your career?
Well, it's interesting because I don't know if there's like a great method to it, but I think that when you're early in your career, you're just around people a lot, and often they're young too. So getting to meet Tom Brady, we were essentially the same age. We graduated from college the same year. And that was just a relationship that we just kind of had that in common. And I'm not saying I was best friends with him by any means. I wasn't. But in terms of media relationships, I was one of the more, friendlier ones, I guess, that's a good way to put it. And then you have people, that you meet along the way that you just, you get to know because they're kind of peers of yours, and you go through these moments at the same times where maybe you get married or have children as they do too. But then there's also building relationships when, it has less to do with that kind of activity and more the actual activity of interviewing. And, when I would interview Coach Belichick, I would always spend so much time preparing. And I wanted to make him think, that was one of my big things. And I struggled sometimes. Sometimes I just didn't, but I thought that, there was a period of time where, I felt like I could talk to Bill just about any time I needed to. And I felt for stories, and I felt like that each time I did, I wanted to show him that I had put some thought and time into this conversation. I remember I wanted to learn about how he learned offense. And, I really went down the rabbit hole. I actually flew to Tennessee to visit with a guy named Ken Shipp, who he studied under in Detroit, really kind of his first exposure hardcore to offense. And, those types of moments, Bill enjoyed talking. You could almost feel him smiling through the phone. And so I think how you build relationships is kind of like a combination of all of those things. And then sometimes you have to, one of the more interesting things, it's a different conversation, but how you build relationships sometimes, because sometimes people don't like what you write. And, that's a process you have to go with because, you got into this to be a journalist, not necessarily to, be their friend.
Along the same lines, we had a question from a person who didn't give a name. What was or what has been your most awkward encounter with Bill Belichick?
There was two. One, the first time I interviewed him in 2001 about Tom Brady, and we were having a great conversation. And, my thought bubble was like, wow, this is like going great. Belichick's different than I imagined. And I asked him a question that was rooted, it was just a wrong question about Bledsoe's injury and his return. And I could just tell that after that, he was like a computer that just sort of froze. And, he was kind of just waiting for this thing to end. Whereas before he was engaged. And then there was another time at the league meetings, I want to say it was 2010, where, I had put in word to talk to him about how they kind of assembled their draft board. Did politics ever come into it? How they, picked each person, however it kind of went down. And he said he would talk to me. So I went and met with him. We were in a lobby of a hotel. And I sat next to him, and he just wasn't into it. And like every question I was asking was just landing wrong. And he wasn't really even looking at me. He was staring at the ground. And, you know, anyone who's interviewed Bill, they've been there, you know, where it's like you've lost him. There's nothing you can do. It's just so awkward, and nobody can stomach awkwardness like Belichick can. So I think after like 15 minutes or so, I said, "Hey, coach, thank you for your time." I got up to leave, and he then just started talking. And it's like he knew what I was trying to get at, even if my questions weren't landing right. And he ended up telling like a lot of like really kind of funny stories and thoughtful stories, and he was just being helpful. And I'll always remember that sequence.
When you go to the league meetings, like I've been to baseball's winter meetings, I don't know, half a dozen times. And it's a very strange experience because you kind of conduct these meetings without the actual executives, who are generally holed up in their hotel suites, and maybe they swing down to the lobby once or twice a day to do media, but otherwise you don't really see them. You just kind of know they're around. Is that kind of how the NFL league meetings work?
I mean, I was just there today, you know. Yes, you know, it's the weirdest thing where we're just kind of in a hotel lobby and the league owners are in a room, and it just feels like that everybody's on their phone. Like you can reach people who are in the meeting because they're staring at their phone, and we're downstairs staring at our phones. It's just it's a very odd dynamic.
Yeah. Okay. I'm glad that the baseball winter meetings are not unique in that respect. Yeah. Yeah. So we have a question from John who says, Bill indicated that he does not recall talking to you relative to your book. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I was very transparent that, you know, Belichick, Brady, and Kraft did not participate for the book specifically. And they didn't stop me from talking to anybody. There was nobody who I reached out to who was like, yeah, Tom told me not to talk to you, or Bill said don't talk to him, or Robert, whatever. I mean, you know, it was a fun reporting process. And, you know, like I said, I wasn't quite sure why Coach Belichick said that, because the public record on our conversations is clear. And, you know, I recorded most of them, and I still have all those because I drew upon them, you know, for this book. So, you know, he was the one who said it. I didn't quite get it. But, you know, all that said, I still felt like that, you know, you talk about, well, you know, access for a book, and, you know, what do you want? You know, obviously you'd love to spend every day with Belichick. You know, Michael Hawley did that a while ago for his Patriots book. It was terrific.
Rain. Yep.
You know, but I felt like that I would rather have the experiences that I had with Brady, you know, being at his house, Super Bowl parties, you know, all these things over the years, you know, especially during the early times. And then even, you know, when he was kind of inventing his TB12, and, you know, the periodic conversations that I had with Belichick over the years, I'd rather have that than sit down with them for an hour and try to like jam in 20 years worth of experiences into 1 hour. I felt like that I knew enough about them and could report from people both inside the building and outside to try to learn more. And, you know, that's why I felt like you know, I had a book, I guess, that I felt worth writing.
And so just to be clear with everyone, that when you say didn't sit down with you for the book was announced, the book deal was announced in March of 2020, right as the world was shutting down, correct? And then you wrote about it for the next year.
It wasn't announced then. It was announced actually right after the Bucs won the Super Bowl, but that's kind of when I really had to start working. Yeah.
Okay. So February 2020, and then so when we say he didn't sit down with you for the book, it's really just for that year's worth of time. It's not, we're not talking about the 20 years that you were working at ESPN, writing stories on the Patriots and on the NFL. In those times, you've spoken with him plenty of times. Just so we're all clear on what spoken to and not spoken to means. Okay, so I think we've got time for one more question. Just let me see here. What we talked about Mac Jones a little bit, but do you have any sense of of any similarities beyond, obviously that they're playing for the Patriots? Like, what do you make of, the fact that, Jones was a first round pick versus Brady being a sixth round pick, or that, Jones started, once he was the starter at Alabama, he was the starter, and it didn't get yo-yoed around the same way that Brady did with Drew Henson. Do you think any of those are necessarily important things to draw on when looking to how Mac Jones's career is going to play out?
I mean, it's a great question, and I don't have an answer for that. I mean, what the book, yes, there are swear words in the book, and there are fights, and, but the book is, and, I know that I saw the question that, someone was like, do you consider yourself a Patriot hater? Absolutely not. I wanted to write about the ingredients to greatness and try to help people understand the DNA that went into it and what some of the costs of that are. But there's nobody who's read the book who thinks it is a negative book on Tom Brady and Bill Belichick and the Patriots. I do my best to just try to present them in the realest way possible, both from my personal experiences and experiences that I reported. And so, I don't know Mac Jones well enough. I'm not sure Mac Jones knows himself well enough to know whether he'll be great at drawing upon the same sort of things that Aaron Rodgers or Tom Brady might draw upon. But the Patriots did this study in the later years of the dynasty, and Belichick loves to commission these internal studies. And he wanted to know kind of when you look at these immortal athletes, what is in their DNA? And, they went out, they interviewed Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant and Tiger Woods and Tom Brady, and, put together this spreadsheet about all these traits and these personality traits going back to their childhood and everything. And Brady was just interesting, and he's always interesting because he's such an anomaly, but all of the other guys focused on rage. And you see that with Michael Jordan a lot with The Last Dance, whereas Brady, yes, he played into some of that, but he seemed best not when he was trying to manufacture conflict or manufacture scars, but when he was kind of in a good, healthy environment. And I think that, that's what he went to Tampa for. He just wanted something else for his final years of his career. And, I think it was one of those things that even though it wasn't meant as a predictor for Brady's future, it was meant as a predictor for the draft and trying to identify characteristics. It sort of helped explain a little bit why Brady would leave, New England and go to a place where, the head coach makes drinks for his coaches after games.
Absolutely. Real quick, one final question. Other than the three principal people in the book, is there anyone who you wanted to interview that you didn't get to, either because just circumstance or because of the pandemic, or just anything like that? Is there anyone that sticks out in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I always wonder if the pandemic hadn't happened, all those games you can go to in the locker rooms, it's a little bit easier. But was there anybody? I don't know.
Anyone who had passed, what would Junior Seau's perspective had been,
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we talked about all those rabbit holes, right, that you can go
right
down. That's definitely one of them. I felt like that, like I said, I wrote to the things that interested me. And, even going back to Brady's high school and trying to talk to his coach, you kind of saw how unique he was, even as, Brady was kind of telling himself a story that he wasn't recruited and whatever that was. I felt like I could accomplish what I set out to do. And like I said, most people got back to me and most people interviewed, and, Dante Scarnecchia and Romeo Cornell and Charlie Weiss, Eric Mangini, all these guys who really had these great insights into Bill's career, to Tom's career. I really enjoyed talking to them.
As I have enjoyed talking to you. Thank you so much for doing this. You can find us every month at the Boston.com book club. When you go to Boston.com, at the top, there's a little menu item that says culture, and you click on that, and then there's another, when you get to the culture page, there's a little menu item that says book club. So you can find our clearinghouse of books. I think this is book 14. We've been doing this for over a year now, and this was our our first book specifically about Boston sports. Hopefully it won't be our last, because hopefully we'll keep hanging banners in this city of champions. But in any case, Seth, thank you so much for doing this with us tonight.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks. And thanks to everybody who showed up and asked questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good night, everybody.
You too.